vitally important distributive results. Actual livelihoods among the African poor are almost always pieced together out of a combination of productive and distributive activities. But the two are not simply added together as two sources of income that together make up a minimal level of subsistence. Rather, they normally catalyze each other in complex ways, so that small-scale production activities, whether crop farming, beer brewing, or sewing dresses, may only be possible for those with access to cash incomes via remittances from employed relatives, while the ability to enforce a distributive claim for those remittances may itself hinge on control of productive resources, such as a rural agricultural base, that the employed kin know that they may need to access in the future. The analytic challenge, then, is to understand how people manage both to use distributed resources for productive ends and to use productive resources for distributive ones. A second example, also very brief, points to the importance of mixed and common urban spaces, which can create a sense of shared social space and common moral community between poverty and poorer classes. As a number of urban scholars have noted in recent years, a recent tendency toward class segregation and urban fortification in the world's great cities has the effect of both inhibiting distributive claims and eroding distributive norms. The tense encounters of the socially mixed city center, including the beggars, pickpockets, thieves, and car washers I mentioned here, provide both a forum for actual distributive processes and an imaginary dramatization of a common social world. New forms of urban segregation, on the other hand, tend to produce propertied classes that spend less time interacting with or even thinking about the poor and are increasingly indifferent to their fate. Viewed in distributional terms, then, planning for mixed urban spaces might have more far-reaching implications for poverty than might be apparent if we view matters in purely productionist terms. We need to think more about what specific policy measures and political demands might make for a more supportive social environment for distributive labor. But we will not be able to make much conceptual progress on this if we persist in misrecognizing distributive labor by forcing it into analytical boxes it does not fit, whether this is informal economy, service sector, micro-enterprises, charity, traditional morality, or what have you. We may make better headway, though, if we start with the actual social situations of the improvising poor and try to build policies and politics that would properly recognize and value the immense work of distributional labor in which they're engaged. Let me conclude by suggesting that a shift in our valuation of distributional processes might help to open up a new kind of politics, one that would explicitly focus on the claim that all have to a rightful share of a common product. This claim is usually not readily accepted. Why should one rightfully have a share of a product that one has not helped produce? Most of the examples I can think of where such a claim has been accepted as legitimate involve mineral wealth. In the U.S. state of Alaska, for instance, the Alaska Permanent Fund makes all legal residents of Alaska shareholders in a portion of the wealth produced by oil production. And residents receive an annual dividend check based not on their participation in production, but their legal status as state residents. It's Alaska's oil. It's your oil. You get a check every year. Norway's Funds for the Future operates on similar premises. And in South Africa, one of the more convincing arguments for programs like the Basic Income Grant has been that ordinary citizens should see some minimal share of the vast wealth that is produced by the country's mining industry. South Africa has gold, platinum, diamonds, all of this. The residents should see some benefit from this. In this reading, the Basic Income Grant would be what is sometimes termed a citizen's income, a rightful share of a common stream of wealth. There is, I suppose, something especially compelling about the idea of a rightful share when the wealth in question derives from precious substances that almost magically emerge from within the earth. But there is no obvious reason why this sort of reasoning needs to be restricted to resource extraction. Consider the most advanced forms of manufacturing today, in which small numbers of highly trained workers run highly automated, capital-intensive production processes, from which emerge, almost magically, vast quantities of goods. The most radical demand in previous times was for the workers to own and operate the factory. More reformist forms of socialism suggested more modestly that the workers should in various ways share the profits that the factory produced. But when a tiny number of workers runs a highly automated factory, neither of these formulations looks very distributed, and both would leave out the vast majority of the population. Instead, the more radical demand today does not depart from the claims of productive labor, but from the claims of distribution, a claim for a universal share in centrally produced wealth. If this sort of demand is to gain any political traction, two tasks must be accomplished. First, the idea of a right to distribution has to be legitimated. The old productionist contempt for handouts will have to be overcome, and a new regard for the legitimacy of receiving a rightful share will have to be nurtured. This must involve revaluing distribution as a worthy end, and not just a distraction from the so-called real work of production. I have suggested that a focus on what I term distributed labor may help here. But it must also involve developing frames of political and ethical reference that would allow for shares to be considered rightful in the first place. The most compelling such frame that is currently available is national citizenship. And this goes back to the point that Craig Calhoun made yesterday. Norwegians are owners of the fund for the future because they are Norwegians. There's no other basis for it. National membership is deemed a sufficient foundation for this property right. And it's a quite substantial property right because it's an enormous fund. But when we turn to the problem of extreme poverty in Africa, national citizenship may not be an adequate frame, since so many of the inequalities that distributive processes need to address are global rather than national in scale. Is it then conceivable that some sort of global norms might emerge, according to which some minimal rightful share might be due not just to all citizens in a nation, but to all citizens of the planet? Can we conceive of, and even begin to advocate for, a global citizen's income? Such a goal may well appear to be impractical, and in realistic terms out of reach. But it has the great advantage that it would give us something to be for, at a time when so much progressive politics seems to be defined only by what it is against. Of course, even if such claims could be legitimated, it would remain for them to be institutionalized. How do you do what Alaska and Norway have done in places like, say, Angola or Equatorial Guinea, that have states that, to put it as politely as possible, do not resemble Norway's? What role might international organizations or philanthropic organizations play in developing new institutions of distribution? We can hardly imagine what a practical politics of distribution might look like on a global scale. But it is surely time to start trying. If I'm right that the current crisis is largely one of distribution, and that conventional left politics are, thanks to productionist blinders, failing to address it successfully, then we will not only need to have a better understanding of how the crucial work of distribution is in fact being done, we will also need creative ideas about how it might in the future be done better. Let me be clear that I do not mean to suggest that either distributionist state policies, like basic income, or informal social processes that enable distributed labor constitute some sort of magical solution, either to the present economic crisis or to the longer-term issue of global inequality. But I would like to leave you with the final thought that today, as in the 1930s, crisis just might provide us with an opportunity to develop new approaches both conceptual and political, to the issue of distribution. Thank you.
Bem, agradecemos a estimulante palestra do professor Ferguson. Não é usual, mas nós temos algum tempo para uma brevíssima rodada de questões, de 3 questões. Mas assim, peço que elas sejam feitas da forma mais clara, objetiva e direta possível. Se houver. Please.
Me identifico, meu nome é Roseli Coelho, eu sou professora da Escola de Sociologia de São Paulo. Você não acha que antes dessa política de distribuição que você propõe, eu acho que você está certo plenamente, concordo plenamente com isso, mas tem uma necessidade de construção do Estado Nacional em termos europeus mesmo, de nation building. A primeira parte é essa, e a segunda parte, o que nós poderíamos responder para os críticos de esquerda ao programa Bolsa Família, que é esse programa de redistribuição, você sabe, do governo atual?
Thank you. Shall I reply? Yes. Yes, thank you. Very stimulating questions. There is a point of view which says that there's no point in talking about social institutions until such time as you have, as you say, a nation-state modeled on the European model of a nation-state, with the full development of the social that took place in the late 19th and early 20th century in Europe. As speaking from the position of African studies, we've been waiting quite a long time for African states to start resembling European nation-states. I personally think that that's a false line of thinking. There's every reason to believe that African countries are capable of great originality, and that the path that they will find for themselves politically and institutionally is likely to be very different from that which took place in Europe. An interesting concrete example is the question of the documentation of populations. In Europe, there was the development of comprehensive registries of population, so that it becomes possible for the state to have a record for each and every citizen. When was this person born? Where were they born? How old are they? Where do they live? How many children do they have? Are they really their children, or do they belong to somebody else? Are these people really married, or are they just saying they are? And so on. Most African states can't begin to answer those questions about their citizens. They don't know how old someone is. Even the person themselves may not know how old they are. People change their names all the time. They change their addresses all the time. It's a mobile and undisciplined population in those kinds of terms. And yet, there's very interesting new thinking going on in the domain of social assistance that says, well, maybe we don't need to know all of that in order to carry out an effective system of distribution. So the advocates of basic income grant in South Africa, for instance, are very interested in biometrics. They say, well, what we really need to know in order to implement basic income is to know whether this person has been paid this month or not. We don't need to know how old he is, because it's an unconditional benefit. We don't need to know where he lives, because it's not territorial. All we need to know is, have you been paid already or not? And if you're trying to get paid twice, we're going to recognize your retina and bounce you out of the machine. And if you haven't been paid yet, then you're welcome. So I think one needs to be a bit skeptical about all that, but also open-minded about the possibility that there are many pathways, many ways in which questions of distribution can be institutionalized. I would say also it's not just pie in the sky, that pensions are paid in Namibia, for instance. All over this very, it's a big country with a small population, and people are spread across it in very remote and hard-to-access villages. Everybody in Namibia gets a pension. And they bring a cash machine out on the back of a pickup truck, and they drive out to each and every village, and people put their thumbprints into a machine, and they get their pensions. So interesting things are going on out there. The second question about left criticism of Bolsa Família. I can't speak to the debates here in Brazil, and I would be very interested to learn more about them. But there's a pretty familiar left critique of proposals like the basic income grant in South Africa that I am familiar with. And it goes like this. It says, what you're doing is taking the people who have the most to gain from a really radical social transformation, and you're buying them off. You're buying them off for pennies on the dollar because you're not really giving them much at all, but you're demobilizing them. Well, maybe so. But the basic income advocates have an interesting counter-argument. And they say, these are exactly the people that you Marxists have never known what to do with, right? You read Marx on the Lumpen proletariat, right? It is not an optimistic analysis. On the contrary, they're saying, if you make these people beneficiaries of a small grant, the first thing you do is create a positive engagement between those citizens and the state that has never existed before. And yes, it's not very much money. So what's the first thing that's going to happen? People are going to come out and say, what? 100 grand a month? I can't live on that. That's ridiculous. There's a domain of mass democratic politics where people will press and argue for a bigger share of the pie. Their argument is that this can make possible new kinds of political mobilization that are not currently possible, and new kinds of political demands that go beyond the demand for a job. Right? And they go to actually something that Marxists ought to be very interested in, which is in a world where everybody doesn't have to sell their labor to the capitalists in order to survive. So I'm not saying which side of that argument is right, but I think that there's an interesting and strong counter-argument to those left critiques.
Bom, a última.
Really quickly, both you and Dr. Cohen have been talking about the nation and the state these days, and to a certain degree, setting it off against the market and what's going on. I'm interested in Pomeroff's new book on ethnicity incorporated. What do you have to say about that? The fact that it's ever more common in the world that ethnicity and nationality is actually being produced by capital in such a way that they cannot be segregated from each other, taken off away from each other. Particularly in the case of South Africa, where you have various ethnicity groups who have now kind of incorporated themselves and are working to use mineral wealth in ways. How does this fit into your analysis of distributed labor?
Yes, well, I think one of the interesting things about markets is that they can cut across the logic of the nation state. Sometimes they can line up with that logic, and sometimes they can confound it. And I think that the ethnicity is a good example of that, where it's possible to build forms of shared identity and even of solidarity that don't have the support of the national state, but that are able to find another kind of a way of being, a brand, if you like, a kind of a niche in a world marketplace that's increasingly dominated by niches. With that said, I also think there's a tendency in a lot of anthropological work to have a sort of reflexively negative evaluation of anything that involves commoditization or markets. That all that is capitalist and bad. And of course, as anthropologists, we should know better. Right? There have been markets of commodities for a long time before there was ever something called capitalism. There's nothing capitalist about buying and selling things. And I think we sometimes suppose that if people are invested in the market as a source of identity or as a source of their life satisfactions, that this is contemptible and bourgeois and capitalist and so on. Marcel Mauss had a much more interesting analysis of this. And I recommend his critique of the Bolshevik Revolution. One of the things where he felt the Bolsheviks had really missed the boat was in demonizing the market. And he said, you know, they're trying to stamp out marketplaces and replace them with a kind of command economy. This won't work. What you'll have is huge efflorescence of black markets, which is, of course, exactly what happened. But more importantly, you're missing the fact that market behavior is a form of sociality. It's not the antithesis of sociality. It's not something that destroys and erodes social relationships. It's the means by which people engage in very meaningful social relationships. So if you look at, there's a whole discussion that implies that to draw people into the cash economy, this destroys their socially embedded relations, because you have this idealized picture of once they lived in a village and they were members of kin groups and so on. And a lot of the analysis in South Africa treats people's entry into the money economy as a kind of destruction of sociality. What strikes me when I read the literature on urban poor people in South Africa is the extent to which it's access to money that enables sociality. It's people who have a little bit of money in their pocket who are thereby enabled to have social networks and have people they can rely on. And it's people who are cut out of the cash economy who are also cut out of social relationships. So again, there's a kind of Maussian counterpoint.
Então, a professora James Ferguson, a sessão está encerrada.